A new report from investment firm RisCura suggests that local asset managers are taking greater responsibility for the sustainability of the assets under their stewardship. RisCura surveyed 52 large and small equity managers in the latter part of last year and held one-on-one interviews with the country's 17 largest equity managers, excluding the Public Investment Corporation. The 52 local equity managers represent about 3.9 trillion rand in assets under management, or about 70% of South Africa's total savings and investment pool of about 5.5 trillion rand. For more, we're joined by Malcolm Fair, who is the Managing Director at RisCura. Malcolm, thank you so much for your time. Let's talk about the aim of the stewardship reports. What are you trying to ascertain from the asset managers?
So, take a step back, is RisCura's, so we're a global investment firm, and we're trying to understand the world of investments and how it impacts on the actual real world. The investments can be a sort of an abstract concept to some, and here's an interface between that concept and actually what is happening in the real world. And the stewardship is this concept of taking care of something on someone else's behalf. So the idea behind stewardship is that you would look after the assets that you own, and that you would help to improve those assets through time so that they could continue to deliver you the good returns in your investments over time. And so the report is really looking at the process of stewardship of assets. In this case, particularly, we focused on equity assets and how well that's being done in the South African environment. By most of the time in South Africa, assets are managed by asset managers on your behalf, so professional people who are licensed to do that on your behalf.
The report was launched in 2011. What are some of the trends you've picked up since it first came out? So when we launched this back in 2011, at the time in South Africa, the concept of sort of being a responsible investor was fairly new in South Africa. It had been something which was pushed globally, perhaps in the early 2000s. And came through into South Africa, and we had the launch of what was called the Code for Responsible Investment in South Africa. And we carried this project out, because it's a key aspect of being a responsible investor is how well are you looking after the assets that you're investing in? Are these assets actually doing good for society? Are they looking after the environment? Are they being well run? Are they well governed assets? And so we did this research report, which we released back then. And really, it was quite interesting to see some of the changes since we did that research that was 10 years ago to now. So, for example, we found in general there was an improvement in how much managers were spending and in leaning into improving assets in South Africa. We also found that there were more service providers in the environment that could help to make that process easier and simpler. And then we found that where managers are engaging directly with corporates, that there was more of that. So there was more practices, more engagement practices. Those practices had evolved. They were becoming more nuanced, that they were tackling more issues, a broader range of issues, etc. And then finally, another important aspect of stewardship is with equities, with shares particularly, is do you vote your proxies as a shareholder, and how well is that process being handled? It's largely a governance thing, but may also involve other issues like corporate events that are happening on the shares, or other say environmental, social issues that are impacted by the decisions that might be being voted on. So it's just checking also that those stewards of the assets are following through and doing the proxy voting, and that process of actually getting the votes through to the company in the time for the AGM is that process is actually functioning well. And so we found improvements in almost all areas. There were some areas though which we found still need quite a lot of work. For example, the one area was collaboration. We think that managers could collaborate a lot better together. The other areas, there's still a lot of focus just on governance and less on sort of environmental factors. What are the factors that impact on a company when it's carrying out its business, and then social factors as well, the stakeholders.
Let's talk about the dilemma around coal, because I found that quite interesting, especially when we talk around ESG. What's the dilemma here, especially when we deal with an asset that occurs in South Africa that we have such great products of?
Yeah, so the coal is a big thing because, for starters, the majority of power that's generated in South Africa is generated through coal. But also, more importantly, globally, a lot of power is generated by coal, and many global many countries buy South Africa's coal to power their power stations. So it's contentious because if you look at global greenhouse gas emissions, it turns out that energy, the generation of energy and electricity, is a huge part of what causes greenhouse gas emissions. And when you look down the list of all of the types of fuels or processes we employ to generate electricity, coal is the highest generator of carbon. So, the focus coming from around the world now is how do we reduce emissions, particularly from thermal coal? And that then has an impact of will people buy coal in South Africa in future? Will we be forced to close down our coal-fired power stations at some point by global regulation, which may be localized? And, how would we handle that? And more specifically from an investment lens is, if you're invested in a company which has coal assets in it, how are those coal assets going to perform? As coal becomes more scarce, maybe the price of coal will go up. That could be good. But on the other hand, maybe there would be lower demand for coal in general, or it would become socially unacceptable to sell coal as a company. And we've seen it in the recent past in South Africa, large global resource companies offloading their coal assets. And that's not necessarily an optimal thing.
Malcolm, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I would have loved to talk to you about some of the opportunities that exist within ESG, especially for this year. But we'll leave that conversation for another day. Thank you so much to Malcolm Fair, who is the Managing Director at RisCura. That is it for me. We'll have more news with Nompumelelo at the top of the hour. Your weather details are up next with Joel. It's a goodbye for me.